Sega challenges you with the ultimate video game, the Sega Master System, with twice as much memory
Dad?
as any other video game. Advanced video technology like scrolling backgrounds, graphics in 64 colors, digital sounds, and light phasers.
Fresh.
And you can add to the excitement with sports pads, control sticks, and the first video games ever in 3D.
Sega's the one.
The Sega Master System. The challenge will always be there.
The story of the Sega Master System really starts in 1983 with the release of its first game console, the SG-1000 in Japan. It was released on the same day as Nintendo's Famicom, but unfortunately did not see the success that Nintendo did. In 1984, Sega's parent company, Golf and Western Industries, divested in non-core businesses, including Sega. Sega now owned itself and put Nakayama as the CEO of the newly founded Sega Enterprises. Also in 1984, Sega released another console called the SG-1000 Mark II. This featured several hardware revisions and also a detachable controllers from the system. Then in 1985, Sega released the Sega Mark III, which was another redesign of the SG-1000. It was engineered by Hideki Soto and Masami Ishiwaka. According to Soto, the console was designed due to the limitations of the SG-1000's GPU, and they wanted something that would be able to compete with the graphics of the Nintendo, so they designed a new graphics chip based on the Sega System 2 arcade board. The Mark III was released in October of 1985 in Japan only, but had problems finding publishers due to the licensing agreements that Nintendo had already set up with most companies. And once again, Sega had a console that was not very successful in Japan. Sega knew they had a great video game system and wanted to release it worldwide to compete with the likes of Nintendo and Atari. In 1986, Sega formed Sega of America with Bruce Lorry, Nintendo of America's former vice president of sales, heading this group. Rebranded as the Master System, the system itself was redesigned, appealing more to the American market. It was first revealed in the summer CES show in Chicago in 1986. The console itself was launched in September of 1986 at a price of $200 in the United States. Sega hoped to sell more than 700,000 units by the end of 1986, but unfortunately their projections fell short, only selling 125,000 units. While Nintendo, at the same point, sold more than 1.1 million units. Just like in Japan, Nintendo had licensing agreements with most American publishers, leading to Sega to develop pretty much their own game library and not having the help of third-party developers. In 1987, Sega sold the distribution rights to the Master System to toy company Tonka. Nintendo had marketed the Nintendo Entertainment System as a toy, so Sega felt that if they marketed it with a toy company, it might increase sales. But Tonka already purchased Kenner Toys in 1987, and after a horrible Christmas season, funds were running low for Tonka. And in 1988 there was an EEPROM shortage, and Tonka did not want to buy the more expensive EEPROMs, not being able to distribute very many games for the Master System, further decreasing sales. Also in 1987, the Mark III was re-released as the Master System in Japan, as also did not sell very well. Now Sega had to move to more markets. They closed the deal in 1987 to have the Master System distributed by Mastertronic in the United Kingdom. Advance orders of the system were very high, but unfortunately the demand was not met as units were not made until Boxing Day, making shipments late. Mastertronic sold the rest of their shares to Virgin to form Virgin Mastertronic, which took over all European distribution in 1988. By 1990, the Master System was the best-selling console in Europe, selling more than 918,000 consoles, greater than Nintendo's 655,000 units. This had European developers pushing to develop on the console, unlike in Japan or the United States. The Sega Master System was also very successful in Brazil, being marketed by Tectoy. The Sega Master System, although not initially successful, did enjoy success in Europe and Brazil and other parts of the world. Being released in Japan in 1985 and being discontinued in Brazil in 1998 gave the console an amazing 13-year run, with worldwide sales between Sega and Tectoy ranging between 20 to 21 million units.
And so it was, late in the 20th century, that a pox fell upon the land, a plague of home videos that were limited in intelligence. There was brain drain, and terminal boredom swept the countryside. The maker looked down and was not pleased by what he saw, and said, "This is not good." And so it was, he brought forth Genesis, a system with twice the power, twice the intelligence, twice the challenge, twice the fun. Only a chosen few were called forth to experience this new dimension of high-definition graphics and stereo sound. And the maker saw what he had done and said, now that's not bad. Discover Genesis, and your world will never be the same.
The story of the Sega Genesis actually started in the early 1980s. Sega's arcade sales were starting to slump and they saw the need to get into the home console market. The push to get into the home console market was led by Sega Enterprises Limited president Hayao Nakayama. So in 1983, Sega released the SG-1000 in Japan only, but the system didn't fare well against Nintendo's Famicom. In 1984, Sega arranged a buyout with their owner, Gulf Western, which Sega was a subsidiary of, and Nakayama was named president of the newly formed Sega Enterprises. Within 2 years of the SG-1000's release, Sega released another console named the Mark III. Now we all in North America know the Mark III as the Sega Master System, which was released here in the United States in 1986 to compete with Nintendo in the American market. However, just like in Japan, unfortunately, the Master System wasn't very successful, which Sega already anticipated, and within just a few days of launching the Master System in the United States, work already began on a new console with two of Sega's best R&D engineers at the helm, Hideki Sato and Masumi Ishikawa. But in 1987, another stroke of bad luck hit Sega. NEC, one of Japan's biggest electronic companies, decided to launch the PC Engine. Sega at this point saw the need for a 16-bit system because of the release of the PC Engine and rumors of a 16-bit console being developed by Nintendo. So the decision was made by Ishikawa to develop a system with a 16-bit microprocessor and a second 8-bit Zilog coprocessor to help take the load off the main processor for the system sound. The exterior design of the Mega Drive was actually trying to emulate audio equipment of the time and also the interior of automobiles. This decision was made to distance itself from toy-looking consoles, hoping to attract older consumers. The Mega Drive was released in Japan on October 29, 1988. Unfortunately for Sega, its release was 1 week after Super Mario Bros. 3 was released on the Nintendo, and with the PC Engine being very popular in Japan as well, Sega was running a distant third in the console race in Japan. Sega now knew at this point it needed to act in North America and fast. Tonka, an American toy company, was marketing the Master System for Sega at the time, but Sega was not impressed by their marketing tactics, so for the Sega Genesis they decided to seek help from another company. Sega then contacted Atari and made a proposal with CEO Jack Tramiel, but Tramiel refused the offer, instead deciding to work on the Atari ST line of computers. So at this point, Sega basically said screw everybody and opened its own Sega of American division to handle marketing and distribution of the Sega Genesis. The Genesis launched to a limited market just like the NES did previously. This was done to test the American market before a full release. It was launched in New York City and Los Angeles on August 14, 1989. And due to the successful sales of the console, it was released to the rest of the United States later that year in several batches. And Sega, in different parts of the world, decided to distribute the market through different companies as well. It was released in Europe and Brazil in September of 1990, and in other parts of the world with different distributors on various dates. Marketing in North America was handled by former Atari Corporation Entertainment Electronics Division President Michael Katz. He wanted to market the system for its arcade-like gameplay and graphics, and came up with the slogan, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." But by mid-1990, Katz did not reach the sales goal by Nakayama for 1 million units, and only 500,000 were sold. So at this point, Nakayama fired and replaced him with Tom Kalinske. He saw that Nintendo was successful with having an iconic video game character like Mario and wanted to repeat that kind of success. At this point, Sega's mascot was Alex the Kid. Although popular in Japan, in the North American market, nobody really knew him and didn't relate to the character. Sonic was made to show the speed and graphic capabilities of the Genesis, along with being a cool character, as Sega was trying to reach a cooler crowd of gamers. The strategy worked and sales of the Genesis increased. Other marketing techniques were put in place, like reducing the cost of the console, hiring developers that targeted American audiences, and a very aggressive ad campaign. Sega was also successful on creating different add-ons for the system as well. With the addition of the power-based converter, 32X, and the Sega CD, Sega had reached the 32-bit and CD-ROM game market, and having backward capability to the Master System helped sales of the old Master System games as well. Sega also showed their hand in the rating system for video games. In the early to mid-1990s, watchdog groups were condemning video games for the violence that they portrayed. Sega even went to congressional hearings because of games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. During these proceedings, the video game rating system was set up, and by December of 1994 was being put on video games. But since there was a rating system now, Sega decided to release Mortal Kombat 2 completely uncensored, and not having to use a code to get the blood and fatalities like in the original Mortal Kombat. So they were really the first to test the system, and it worked, as we can see by the games that are released today. Sega discontinued the Genesis in 1997, selling over 30 million units worldwide. Another 4.5 million units were sold by other distribution companies worldwide as well, bringing the total to about 35 million consoles. With most of these sales being in North America and Europe, Sega finally achieved success in the home console market with help of great marketing and one little hedgehog.
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD? Huh? What are you waiting for? Nintendo to make one? You have seen the games, right? Wrong answer, man. Show 'em! Want to see more?
The story of the Sega CD really starts in Japan in 1988. NEC was rumored to release a CD-ROM based system by the end of the year. Sega had just released the Sega Mega Drive in Japan to compete with the 16-bit PC Engine. But NEC was looking to step up the game with an add-on to the PC Engine called the PC Engine CD-ROM. Sega knew that the CD-ROM was the media of the future, and decided to develop its own add-on CD-ROM system for the Sega Mega Drive. Sega did not have the capability to make its own CD-ROM system, so it partnered with JVC to help. Sega enlisted Tomio Tamaki to lead this project. Sega wanted a CD-ROM based system that could match or even outperform the PC Engine CD-ROM. They originally decided to double the amount of RAM that the NEC version had, but this was not enough. Rumors started to fly that NEC was developing a different, more powerful CD add-on that was to be called the Super CD-ROM that would have up to 512 kilobytes of RAM. Sega upped the ante and decided to put 6 megabits of RAM into this system. But that was not all. They also decided to add another Motorola 68000 CPU, but clocked at 12.5 MHz, almost twice the speed of the Mega Drive CPU. On top of this, they added a custom GPU that could perform scaling and rotation effects. Also, not to be outdone with audio, they included a custom Riot sound chip that was capable of producing 10 channels of sound of audio, partnered with what the Mega Drive's YM2612 and SN76489 chips were providing for the system sound. The system would be able to play games, audio CDs, CDG video discs, and karaoke discs. The Mega CD was released in December of 1991 in Japan with only 2 games, Heavy Nova and Soul Feast. Other games released later that month included Nostalgia 1907, Ernest Evans, Funky Horror Band, and Tinka Fabu. But it wasn't until months later that games really started to hit the market. This led to sales in Japan being strong at first, but dying off quickly because the system really didn't have a great library at launch. During the development of the system, Sega was very protective of the technology that went into it. In fact, they were so secretive about it, they didn't even release a real version to Sega of America until it was almost too late. Sega of America had to procure its own ROM to put into the dummy unit to make it functional. To their dismay, the system had some major issues. The CD drive tray mechanism was flimsy and prone to break, but the worst issue was with the CD drive mech itself drawing too much current and releasing magic smoke from the system's capacitors. Rumor has it that the units actually caught on fire, but this is truly just a rumor. Only the caps blew, causing the system to smoke. The system was revised and released in North America as the Sega CD. When the Sega CD released in North America in October of '92, it was promised to have at least 20 games at launch, but Sega was not able to do this. It launched with 4 games. Unlike Japan, games started to be made right away, and by the end of the year there were 15 games published. Reception of the system is mixed. The system itself and the technology behind it was good, but the lack of games at launch time and the overuse of full motion video really didn't appeal to too many people. As time went on, the system never really caught on, but many great games were made for it. Also, games like Night Trap and Lethal Enforcers were instrumental at the beginning of the ESRB ratings for video games due to their sexual and violent content. The Sega CD was released in Japan in 1991 and discontinued in 1996, giving the console a 5-year lifespan. Although it seemed to be unpopular, it did sell over 2.2 million units with a total of 205 games being made. In my eyes, that's a pretty successful system for an add-on.
Machine has appeared in homes across America.
Double and redouble his power. 32.
6 times more powerful than 3DO.
Alright, baby.
40 times more than Super NES.
Hey, yo, there is no 32-bit Super NES. Are we gonna see the games or what? Show me!
Increase the power of the unit 40 times.
Thank you.
The story of the 32X started in January of 1994. Sega president Hayako Nakayama was worried about the Atari Jaguar that was released in November of '93, taking a share of the gaming market away from Sega. This was due to the fact that Sega was already working on Project Saturn, but it was not scheduled to be released until late 1994 in Japan and mid-1995 in North America. He was so worried that during the CES show, he called Joe Miller, head of Sega of America's R&D department, and conferenced in Sega of America's producer, Scott Bayless, Sega of America's vice president of technology, Marty France, and Sega hardware team, Hideki Sato, advising them of developing a quick response to the Jaguar. After the phone call, Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske argued that they could get another year of life out of the Genesis without the need of another system. Sega of Japan disagreed and wanted a whole new system design. This started the development of Project Jupiter, a whole new system based off the Genesis. This new system would have been a 32-bit system with an upgraded color palette and some 3D capabilities. But Miller disagreed with this idea, stating that if you're just going to upgrade the same system, you might as well just make an add-on for it. Sega of Japan and America compromised, and another add-on was made for the Genesis. They discontinued Project Jupiter and started Project Mars. The Sega of America team headed the Mars project. They designed it to use 2 of the 32-bit Super H2 Hitachi CPUs that were developed in 1993 jointly with Sega for use in the Saturn. But for this project, the clock speed was reduced. The system would be able to use the Sega Genesis CPU, GPU, and sound chips. If you had the Sega CD, it could use its hardware as well. Although only 5 games were released in the CD format that used the Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X's hardware altogether. Although the system's design was more powerful than originally conceived using the Saturn's processors, it was not going to be compatible with the Saturn, being its own system. The system was marketed to people who wanted to get into the 32-bit gaming market but couldn't afford the upcoming Saturn. It was also seen as a transitional device between the 16-bit Genesis and the 32-bit Saturn. The 32X was released in November of 1994 in North America for $159 at the same time the Saturn was being released in Japan. Sales in the unit were initially strong. Over 1 million units were ordered, but Sega was only able to produce 600,000 units by the end of 1994, due to the shortage of CPUs being used in the Saturn as well. By Christmas of '94, 500,000 units were already sold, exceeding Sega's expectations. 6 games were available at launch at the price of $69.99 apiece. It didn't take long for consumers to see that the system was not as good as the hype around it. Development of the system was difficult, making it hard for Sega to secure publishers for games. Most publishers wanted to make games for the upcoming Saturn and not this transitional system. Sega sent out development kits, but by this time it was too late. Game publishers bailed on the 32X, with only a total of 40 games being made for the system, most being rushed out and not being completed. Sega was impressed with the sales figures early in the release. They started development of another system, the Sega Neptune. This was to be a Sega Genesis and 32X in one console, but soon after this, the media was starting to be very critical about Sega's strategy. Word got out about the games, and the price point, and sales started to plummet. Several of the publishers for the 32X, such as Capcom and Konami, bailed at this point. This was the beginning of the end for the 32X. By mid-1995, it was clear to Sega that the 32X was not going to be successful, and they ordered Sega of America to concentrate its efforts on the Saturn. By September of '95, the price of the units were decreased to $99. By 1996, the system was discontinued, and a fire sale started, trying to clear out the remaining inventory, selling the units for $19.99 apiece. Sega had made the same mistake Atari had made, competing with itself. Also, the fact that the system was difficult to develop games for, the publishers bailed, and the price was just too high for an add-on, led to the death of the system. In the process, they lost consumer confidence as consumers saw the 32X as just a greedy money grab between the Genesis and the Saturn. That brings us to the end of the 32X. It had a very short 2-year lifespan, starting in 1994 and being discontinued in 1996, with just over 800,000 units being sold, making it Sega's worst commercial failure.
We are 5 years away from entering the 21st century. Humankind stands on the edge of the interactive age. You have come a long way. But are you ready for the future?
Introducing Sega Saturn. Aww, hit it! Sega's next-generation gaming platform, revolutionary sports and arcade gameplay, all with amazing new 3D experiences never before possible on home game systems. Wow.
Sega Saturn. It's how you play the game.
What's happening?
Sega
Saturn!
Go farther than you have ever gone before. Sega Saturn. Play your games in the 21st century and leave the rest of the world behind.
The story of the Sega Saturn starts in 1992. Sega knew they had to come up with the next-gen video game console to stay competitive in the gaming market. Sega's Hideki Soto headed the development team of the new console, codenamed Project Saturn. By 1993, Sega teamed up with Hitachi to develop a new 32-bit RISC CPU that would be used in the new console. The new processor would be called the Super H RISC Engine, or SH2 for short. The Saturn would be developed around a dual SH-2 configuration. Sega was mostly finished with the design of the Saturn by the end of 1993, but info was leaked about the upcoming Sony PlayStation, and Sega decided to add another video display processor to the Saturn to improve 2D performance and 3D texturing too. This gave the Saturn 2 VDPs as well. During this time frame, Tom Kalasky didn't like the architecture of the Saturn and wanted to go with supercomputer maker Silicon Graphics for its 3D chips and design. Sega of Japan didn't like this idea. Nintendo later contracted with Silicon Graphics for the development of the N64. Also in 1993, Sega restructured its internal game studios to better suit development of 3D games. They enlisted Team Andromeda, which were part of the arcade development team, to design 3D games for the new console. In early 1994, the Sega Titan arcade system came to be, based off the Saturn's architecture, Acclaim being the developer for it in the United States. In early 1994, per orders of Sega of Japan, Sega of America started development of the 32-bit add-on for the Sega Genesis called the 32X. This was to be a transitional device between the Genesis and the Saturn, for people who could not afford the upcoming Saturn. It would use much of the same hardware as the Saturn, such as the SH-2 CPUs, but would be incompatible. Sega of America president Tom Kalasky did not like the idea of the 32X, wanting to instead get at least another year of life out of the Genesis with no more add-ons. He just saw it as a bad idea, but Sega continued on with the development of the two 32-bit systems that would launch at the same time in 1994, the Saturn in Japan and the 32X in North America. The Saturn released in November of 1994 in Japan with the pack-in game of Virtual Fighter. The initial 200,000 units were sold out in the first day. Sega waited to release more units to the market until December 3rd, 1994, the day the PlayStation released in Japan, to stymie their sales. By the time 1994 was over, Sega had sold more than 500,000 units, while the PlayStation had only sold 300,000 units. This did not last long though, as the sales of the PS1 took off in 1995, leaving the Saturn behind. Sony started to attract more third-party developers due to the cheap licensing fee of only $10 and a well-designed development kit. In March of 1995, Kalasky announced the Saturn would be launched September 2nd in the United States. However, Sega of Japan wanted the console to be released earlier. During the E3 show on May the 11th, Kalasky announced the release of the Saturn for the price of $399. 30,000 units were shipped out to Toys R Us, Babbage's, Electronics Boutique, and Software etc., and available for sale that day. This enraged other retailers that were not advised of the release. Stores such as Best Buy, Walmart, and KB Toys stopped selling Sega products because of this. During the E3 show, PlayStation announced they would release their console at a price of $299, to the applause of the crowd.
Some of you might actually want to know what that price is. Since it's a beautiful day here in Los Angeles, I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Race, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
All this started to make Sega look bad. With its release in the US, only 6 games were ready with the pack-in game Virtual Fighter. This game was not as popular in the United States as it was in Japan, making more people wait for the PlayStation release. People started to compare games such as Daytona USA versus Ridge Racer on the PlayStation. There was a noticeable difference with Ridge Racer being almost arcade quality, while Daytona USA was just not as good as the arcade. In October, Sega announced a price reduction of the Saturn to $299, the same as the PlayStation. However, not to be outdone, Sony announced in May of 1996 another price reduction to $199. The next day, Sega announced their price reduction to the same amount as the PlayStation's. But for Sega, they were now losing money on each console they sold. By 1995, Sega still accounted for 40% of the US gaming market, but with the arrival of the PlayStation, things were taking a dramatic swing. By 1996, Kalansky, which wanted to just continue on with the Genesis until the launch of the Saturn, wanted out of Sega. He left in September of 1996, and that started a shakeup at Sega of America. Several people either quit or moved positions, as Sega of America was being reformed. Also in 1996, Sega of America STI team was developing a new 3D Sonic game for the 32X. But since the 32X was being discontinued, it was now to be released on the Saturn. The game was to be called Sonic Extreme, and to be a fully immersive 3D world, a first for a Sonic game. The game was being rushed to be completed by December of 1996. However, the lead programmer quit, and several of the other team members got sick, and it was apparent that the game would not be completed by December. Sega canceled the game. Not long after this, the STI team was disbanded. With the cancellation of Sonic Extreme, a lack of third-party developers, being hard to develop for, and retailers refusing to sell Sega products, were all nails in the Saturn's coffin. Sony had taken the lead in the market share for gaming consoles in the US, leaving Sega behind. By 1997, Sony had 47%, Nintendo 40%, and Sega only 12% of the gaming market. By 1998, Sega was almost ready to release the next game console. With sales of the Saturn not doing well in the US and Europe, they decided to call it quits on the Saturn in those regions. It did continue on in Japan for a couple more years until the year 2000, when it was canceled there too. The Sega Saturn had a 6-year lifespan, being released in Japan in 1994 and discontinued in the year 2000, selling 9.26 million units worldwide. The console is considered to be a failure by Sega due to the early release in the US, not enough games at launch, and disagreements internally at Sega leading to bad business decisions.
We got her! Hi, Randy.
Well, hello.
It's thinking.
The story of the Sega Dreamcast starts in 1995. Sega was already looking into their new console. It had been reported that they held meetings with several companies to help in the development, such as Lockheed Martin and 3DO, to name a couple. With the release of the Sega Saturn in 1994, and all the issues surrounding it, such as it being hard to develop for, lack of third-party developers, and issues with US retailers selling Sega products, all had Sega looking for a way out of the Saturn as financial losses were starting to take a toll. By 1996, longtime president of Sega of America, Tom Kalansky, had resigned his position and was replaced by Shoichiro Irimajari, and Bernie Stoller became Sega of America's vice president in charge of product development and third-party relations. With the release of the PlayStation and in 1996 the release of the N64, Sega saw sales dwindle. By late 1997, Sega only held on to only 12% of the game console market, with Nintendo being at 40% and Sony at 47%. Due to Sega performing so poorly, Sega president Hayao Nakayama, which had been president of Sega since 1983, stepped down. Irimajari took over the position, with Stoller becoming CEO of Sega of America. At this point, Sega discontinued the Saturn. By 1998, Sega had reported its first consolidated financial loss since 1988 on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. It reported a $269.9 million loss. Now, back in 1997, Irimajari hired on IBM's Tatsuo Yamamoto to head on an 11-person team to work on a top-secret project called Black Belt. Also during this time, Sega's Hideki Soto had also started development of a new console. Reports vary whether or not Irimajari had started the two-team development, or if Sato started it on his own. Sato's group decided to go with Hitachi's SH4 processor with the VideoLogic Power VR2 graphics processor by NEC. This project was named White Belt, then changed to Doral, named after the female fighter in the Virtual Fighter game series. Yamamoto's team decided to go in another direction. They decided to go with the 3DFX Voodoo 2 and Voodoo Banshee GPUs and a Motorola PowerPC 600E CPU. Sega's management ultimately decided to go with Sato's design using the SH4 and PowerVR architecture. This decision was thought to have been made because of Sega's relationship with NEC being a Japanese company. Stoller didn't like the idea of the use of the PowerVR GPU and wanted to use the 3DFX GPU, but Sega of Japan ultimately decided to go with the PowerVR, which led to a lawsuit by 3DFX against Sega for breach of contract, and was settled out of court with an undisclosed amount paid out to 3DFX. At this time, the project was renamed again to Project Katana. Also during this time, EA Games was not happy with Sega's decision to go with the PowerVR GPU either. They didn't really know how to program for it, instead wanting Sega to go with the 3DFX. Also, EA wanted an exclusive contract for sports games, which Sega didn't want to do. Because of this decision, no EA games would be available on the Dreamcast, and Sega went on to produce their own sports games along with developer Visual Concepts, which headed the 2K Sports game series. Sega touted the system to be easy to develop for, unlike their previous system, the Saturn. So easy, in fact, that you could make a game that would run on a Pentium 2 200 PC and easily port it over to the new system. Microsoft developed a custom version of Windows CE that ran on the system using DirectX's APIs and dynamic link libraries, making it really easy to port over PC games. Sega also made their own OS to be used in the development of games for the system, with most developers going with it instead of Microsoft's OS, as it had greater performance capabilities. The Katana project was revealed on May 21, 1998 in Tokyo, and Sega held a public naming competition for the new system. Over 5,000 names were submitted, with Dreamcast being the chosen one, thought up by developer Kinji Uno. The name is a combination of the words dream and broadcast. It is said that Sega spent $80 million on hardware development, up to $200 million on software development, and $3 million on promotions and advertisements worldwide, getting it ready for launch. The Dreamcast was launched in Japan on November 27, 1998 for the price of 29,000 yen, with 4 games available at launch. Within one day they had sold out of the entire inventory of Dreamcast. Sega at this point hoped to sell more than 1 million units by February of 1999, but only sold 900,000 units, falling short of the mark. Because of this, and the fact that Sony had just leaked info about the upcoming PS2, Sega lowered the price of the unit to 19,900 yen, which helped give Sega 17% of the console market by late 1999. In August of 1999, Stoller had been fired and Peter Moore had took over his position. The Dreamcast launched on September 9, 1999 in North America, with 18 games available for the price of $199.99. But Sega had started thinking about the American market and started a contract with Hollywood Video to rent the console out before the launch date, giving people a sneak peek at the console before it actually launched. Sega also repaired its relationships with the American retailers that stopped selling Sega products after the early release of the Saturn. Sega hit a sales record, selling more than 255,000 units in the first 24 hours. By November, Sega had announced that they had sold over 1 million units. Things were looking good for the Dreamcast. But as the launch of the PS2 was coming and more info about it was coming out, sales of the Dreamcast started to slow down. The PS2's GPU is much more powerful, But the thing that kept people from buying the Dreamcast was the fact that the PS2 would be able to play DVDs and have games on DVD, giving games much more space for programs and making bigger and better games. Also, Nintendo announced their next upcoming console, the GameCube, and Microsoft started development of the Xbox. Sales of the Dreamcast dwindled, and Sega reported a net loss of $404 million by March of 2000. Moore had said for the Dreamcast to be viable, it would have to sell 5 million units by the end of the year. Unfortunately, it only sold 3 million, leaving Sega with another loss of 163 million, and by March of 2001, it had went over $417 million in losses. On May 22, 2000, Sega chairman Asio Akawa replaced Irizarami as president of Sega. He had always wanted Sega to get out of the hardware market and become just a developer. In September of 2000, Sega held a board meeting and agreed at this point to leave the console market. On January 31, 2001, it was announced that the Dreamcast was to be canceled in March, and Sega reduced the price of the unit to $99 to get rid of the remaining inventory. The price was reduced 2 more times to $79 and then $49. This marked the end of Sega becoming a console manufacturer. It also marked the end of an era, and the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast was officially canceled on March 31, 2001. So that brings us to the end of the Dreamcast story. With the console launching in 1998 in Japan and being discontinued worldwide in 2001, gave the system a short 3-year lifespan, selling over 9 million units in total and being Sega's last video game console.
Game over, man. It's game over.